Hi everyone, thank you very much, and thank you Vivian for defining the manosphere so wonderfully so I don't have to. My name's Stephanie Wescott. I'm from Monash University, from the School of Education, Culture and Society. I'm talking today about work that I've been doing for a couple of years now with my colleague, Professor Stephen Roberts, on the manosphere in Australian schools. Although I will say when we first began this research, we commenced because we were reading news stories about the presence of Andrew Tate's mannerisms, sayings, ideology in schools in the UK. And so we were interested in whether the phenomenon was occurring in Australian schools as well. We quickly discovered that yes, it was. And we were inundated and continue to be inundated with teachers, email correspondence, social media correspondence from teachers wanting to speak with us, but also parents too. Increasingly we hear from parents who, mainly of girls, teenage girls, who are having distressing experiences in schools and they don't know what to do about it. They've sort of exhausted all of their possibilities from within the school. So we now talk about the manosphere to more broadly encapsulate the ideology that we're referring to, but we began talking about Andrew Tate initially. Andrew Tate continues to be an enduring figure in my life, unfortunately, because of this research, and his role in the manosphere and in politics and society continues to evolve. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that. However, the sort of relevance of Andrew Tate as a figure of the manosphere is contested, certainly among the lives of young men. However, when we began this research, Andrew Tate was the key figure among boys of secondary school age, but also primary school age, unfortunately. So our initial research was specifically on the proliferation of Andrew Tate among young men and women's experiences of that. So just to touch really briefly on what we know, Andrew Tate has been identified as a key influencer in many young men's lives. Of course, he's been banned from various platforms, reinstated on X, thanks Elon Musk, but his content is deaggregated, so it's, sort of meshed up in all different kinds of ways. He, as touched on, and all manosphere content creators exploit fears that may be very real to the young people who they appeal to, and mainstreams misogyny in ways that we've heard about today. And one more disturbing element of this too is the way that algorithms are designed to promote this content to accounts that are identified as belonging to young men and boys. So you do not have to search for this content if you are a young man using social media. It will find you. Of course, we know from recent survey data that boys and men aged 18 to 30 years old who prescribe to limiting beliefs about masculinity, such as those that they may find resonate within the manosphere, are more likely to have perpetrated violence. So we're beginning to, that connection is beginning to be established. But we're specifically looking at how this is located in schools, how it's manifesting, but also how the school itself can perpetuate manosphere ideology and also fail to stop it from proliferating. And the key thing to note is that talking about gender-based violence in a school context is not new. There's decades of research and education on this and the treatment of women in school contexts, and if you've been a woman in a school, you will know and probably have experienced this. I was a teacher myself, and that was a normative and expected feature of your work, that you would be sexually harassed, experience sexism and feel misogyny in your work. However, our research on Andrew Tate specifically found increasing and disturbing levels of sexism and sexual harassment that intersected with the rise of Andrew Tate's popularity online, but also with the return from remote and lockdown schooling. So teachers reported to us that when they returned to face-to-face teaching, there was an explosion of misogyny, and that is a quote from one of our participants in our first study, that it wasn't just the sort of parroting or repetition of Andrew Tate-isms, or even the use of a particular hand gesture that Andrew Tate uses to signal male supremacy. It was also overt and covert misogyny, sexual harassment and sexism. And interestingly, there's a paper by Kerry Robinson from the year 2000 titled, excuse my language, Great Tits Smears. And that exact phrase was repeated in our study 30 years later. Almost 30 years later. So we tend to say that, yes, this has always been a problem. However, there has been a very, very tangible increase and shift in expressions of this kind of behaviour, things that are very disturbing and upsetting, and that are workplace issues. So, of course, we talk about schools as schools, but schools are workplaces, and they are workplaces where lots of women work. But one of our participants said that this is a female-dominated profession that doesn't look after women. So that's an ongoing issue. There are some things that we are contending with when we're talking about how to respond to this problem in school contexts. The first thing to note is Robinson in 2000 wrote that sexual harassment in schools has not gained the serious attention it warrants. We continue to suggest the same thing. Also that there's been an increase in hostilities towards women, girls and gender diverse people across multiple regions, and this is a landscape that's reflected in education settings, this sort of tension among genders in schools. And Vivian, some of the things that you were mentioning about men expressing their lack of their rights or difficulties in the family court system are ideas that boys are putting to their teachers. These are 14, 15-year-old boys who are talking about family court as if that's an anticipated problem that they might have. Who knows? Maybe. There's also been some difficulties in progress on policy initiatives in Australia related to gender and schooling for various reasons. I'm going to talk about some of them today. But Suzanne Gannon has described policy containing glaring gaps, stymied by erasure and avoidance. Amanda Keddy has argued that policy responses labour under what she terms the boy turn of the 1990s, that represented a shift away from a concern with social justice to a construction of boys as a disadvantaged group. And this is a discourse that we are contending with constantly, and it appears it's a prioritisation of the potential to upset one group over the sort of human rights of another group, being the girls who are exposed to misogyny and gender violence in their classrooms. There's also recent backlash to feminism and gender equality initiatives that has deterred those who might be in a position to improve girls' and women's safety in schools, and also we are always having culture wars in education. Gender and sexuality is an ongoing culture war. I've written about safe schools, what happened to safe schools as a sexuality and gender culture war, and so that just sets up a particular environment in which it becomes or is perceived as controversial to talk about gender issues in schools. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are in place at the moment and what evidence we have of how useful those things are and how they're implemented. I'll be drawing on some survey data that we've recently collected from teachers around Australia about their experiences of sexism historically and in contemporary times, but also how they feel respectful relationships has been implemented in their schools. So respectful relationships is a curriculum that has been around for a long time, but is sort of more recently receiving more attention and increasingly being seen as an evidence-based approach to intervening in responding to and preventing violence. Debbie Ollis, who's one of the authors, original authors of Respectful Relationships in all its forms, has been writing about this for a long time, but writes about the origins of this kind of approach in education dating back to 1993. However, in 2016 in Victoria, the Royal Commission into Family Violence made a recommendation that respectful relationships education become mandatory in Victorian government schools. I was working as a teacher at this time, and my school was part of the pilot program that rolled out mandatory respectful relationships education. And so it's the word mandatory is important to hold on to when I get to the data that we have on what implementation looks like. Important to note too is that respectful relationships education itself as a curriculum has a very strong evidence base. There are 7 core elements, evidence-based elements for best practice in schools that are featured here. This is from a review from Our Watch. First of all, that it addresses the drivers of gender-based violence, that it takes a whole school approach, that the change is supported by a professional learning strategy for teachers, and a couple of others there, but those first 3 are pretty key to the data that I'll go through today. A recent evaluation of respectful relationships education by colleagues at Monash University, led by Dr. Naomi Fitzner, found that there were some common practice and policy challenges to implementation. First of all, sustainable whole-of-school approaches are an issue, high-quality teaching materials are an issue, professional development availability for teachers is an issue, and then monitoring and evaluation of the quality is an issue identified in this evaluation. So I'm going to go to some of our survey data now on teachers' experiences of the implementation of respectful relationships education. This was a survey that we advertised over the course of last year. We received about 110 responses, and we asked teachers of all genders to just tell us about what their experiences were of sexism, etc. in schools, but also of the implementation of respectful relationships education. And I've just taken some accounts here of teachers who are based in Victoria, just because of the mandatory element of the curriculum there. Sorry for the tiny text, but I'm just going to draw out a couple of key things. I've sort of themed the issues according to a couple of themes. There's ideological issues, there are structural issues, and there's one other one that I can't remember, but it'll come up. So these are a few accounts here from different teachers in Victoria. One is that multiple people are requesting training for LGBTQIA+, but it is currently overlooked for other programs that include separation of gendered issues, which can lead to more misogyny within students due to a lack of information taught to all students. Respectful relationships, according to this second teacher, is taught as a once a semester standalone micro or short lesson, which is not what it is intended to be. Lessons are curated by PE staff and wellbeing staff, with male identifying teachers teaching the male students and women taking the girls, which is also not as it is intended. Despite the evidence suggesting that male violence is more prevalent, the lessons present gendered violence and consent as both male and female issues, and this is due to critical feedback from male students reporting that they feel targeted by respectful relationships education. This third teacher is from a Catholic school. Respectful relationships is awkwardly embedded. We follow small parts of the program or embedded in piecemeal ways. Apparently, the risk of parent backlash in our single-sex Catholic school setting is more important than the current views and standards of relationships in the law. This sort of taking bits and pieces of respectful relationships education is quite common. So is fear of backlash. So in particular, teachers mention that they will not cover the gender component, anything to do with gender, because it is considered controversial and may spark backlash. Another account, respectful relationships was done in an ad hoc manner, very little training. This doesn't bother me because I'm comfortable, but many teachers were not comfortable. There was a high level of absenteeism on the wellbeing days when they would teach respectful relationships, which has resulted in it being dumped for tokenistic positive psychology sessions. And this last teacher here says, I know it's been delivered, but I'm not sure that leadership are committed to the reality of the misogyny that exists. And this is something that we've written about previously, this sort of disconnect between how women teachers in the school are experiencing the culture and the climate of the school and how their school leaders are understanding that experience that they're having. The second theme I want to talk about is structural implementation issues, so things that are sort of let down by the school itself and how it's set up. So this teacher in a Victorian Catholic school says it's part of the wellbeing learning area, part of pastoral care. It's something that is stabbed at willy-nilly. It's addressed a few times a year, normally as a response to rioting students in junior year levels. It's always done in a classroom setting, always in large groups. For students who are most vulnerable, that is traumatic to say the least. The second teacher says that it's a box-ticking exercise. There's no whole-of-school implementation. It was mostly taught through a Year 9 special program, supplemented with one-off workshops, or engaged as a reaction to an incident, so the school could reassure parents that they were doing something. And finally, I was a pastoral care leader. I oversaw implementation of respectful relationships. Our school highly values respectful relationships, but like most things, we don't have enough time, resources or money to make an impact. So under this theme, teachers tended to talk about how the school wasn't set up in sort of timetabling or policy or resourcing in some instances to implement it fully, even if it was valued and even if it was felt to be important. Also implementing it as a reaction to something that has occurred rather than as a proactive measure for prevention. And the last theme is institutional implementation issues, so problem within the school itself as an institution. This teacher in a government school in Victoria said that it's delivered for 1 week in a Year 9 subject, that was it. Staff were not trained or confident. I once sat in to observe a lesson and was asked to step in and talk about contraception because I was the only female in the room and the men didn't know how the pill works. I had an extra class once covering LGBTQI plus identities and had to ask someone to stall while I updated the slides because they were outdated and offensive. Second teacher says the program is implemented and updated annually. Male voices are given priority in terms of updating curriculum and women's suggestions are overlooked. Third there, from a teacher in a government school, it's taught by health and PE staff. What we say, our expectations for respectful behaviour and what we see and treat seriously do not match. Too many sexist behaviours, like male students groping female students, are happening on a regular basis. Small number of offenders and a group of victims. These students remain in the school and many of our students do not feel safe. School policies and disciplinary procedures need to more strongly reflect respectful relationships, as is the intention of a whole-of-school approach that would address embedded and persistent cultural issues. And finally, it is taught but not enforced in culture. So there's that disjoint there between you can teach the content, but is it actually embedded culturally in the school? Therefore, the program only carries empty words. I won't read out that next line, but students say offensive things with no consequence. So some other initiatives that exist and are frequently taken up by schools are sort of one-off or possibly multi-day programs, that external providers will come into the school and run workshops with boys. There are a couple that exist, but mainly we hear about the Man Cave and Tomorrow Man. There's a very limited evidence base on these programs and their efficacy, and they're also very expensive, which is prohibitive to schools that are not as well resourced. There's been an evaluation on the Man Cave completed by some colleagues at Monash. Some key findings. There were some positives about safe spaces for vulnerability, rapport, but the review found that attitudinal and knowledge shifts do not translate into enhanced skills or changes in behaviours. Workshop appears to challenge masculine norms that lead to negative mental health outcomes, which is a positive, but norms of masculinity that require men to be strong and unfeeling will not change if broader gender inequalities are not also addressed. So obviously there's only so much you can do in a one-off session, and schools may be reluctant to engage on multiple days with a provider because of budget constraints. However, this review did find that it was important that any program that is engaged with is implemented across multiple days, not single one-off sessions, although that may be an approach that schools choose if they've been reactive, for example, to an incident. I just skipped over a slide and now I don't know how to go back. Okay, and I slipped over another initiative is actually a program or a project that we are working on that is funded by Anne Rose. We are currently working on training teachers to lead lead a program within their school, or training for their own teachers on how to engage with these problems and how to counter these ideologies within their schools. We've so far done some workshops with young people, and this week we're starting some focus groups with teachers to hear from them about what a program like this should look like. What do schools need, what do teachers need, and how can we design something for them that will work. So that's an 18-month project, and we're 1 year into that project. In summary, there are a range of ideological, structural and institutional challenges that continue to challenge how we can do transformational work around this in schools. One of them that is ideological is expectations within the community, within parents, that the curriculum should be neutral, that anything to do with gender is a political topic rather than a lived reality or an apolitical topic. Similarly, existing associations around gender-related topics being controversial, and a lack of connection between gender-based violence and what is happening in schools, or how schools may act as places that fosters or foments attitudes that exacerbate violence. There are structural issues, of course, in schools around resourcing. How can staff be trained? For example, if they're not able to leave the school for a day to receive training, there's no one to replace their class. We have a significant teacher shortage too, and that is an issue because if you do not have a consistent teacher in your classroom, it's difficult to form relationships and to work with young people. Staff workloads is an issue. Staff work type expectations, so there, of course, are teachers who are resistant to doing this type of work in their schools. They sort of may have the view that I teach maths and that's what I do and I don't get into any of this stuff. Expertise in schools, whether there is someone who can lead this or drive this, just usually that will arise from personal interest, not from training. Various implementation issues. And of course there are institutional problems within schools themselves, contextual norms that are part of the school that perpetuate harmful ideas about gender and gender norms. Lack of reporting mechanisms and complaint processes. So when things happen in schools, women report that their complaints don't proceed, that they don't go anywhere. We've written a paper about institutional gaslighting where women actually actively experience gaslighting by their leaders, by their bosses, who are also the principals. And of course, regressive understandings of and expectations for conduct and behaviour. So boys will be boys is still a prevailing understanding and expectation for behaviour in schools. So there's a few things that arise from the evaluations that we have and the literature that we have about how this work should be done. First of all, multiple session programs at the very least, but ideally a whole of school approach. Gender transformative approaches, take a critical perspective on gender, and adaptable content based on what students already know. In terms of respect for relationships, leadership to a commitment from government. We've seen it in Victoria to an extent. Strengthening respect for relationships, ensure teachers feel comfortable, increase their capacity, national coordination mechanism for respect for relationships. Some of the feedback we hear too is there's an emphasis in schools on providing more male role models for boys, that boys just need someone they can look up to who's also male. However, there is literature that boys who have critical perspectives on gender and who understand gender equity, they accept ideas from people of all genders, not just men. And indeed, feminist mothers are important. That's a finding of this research paper here, Mully and Epstein. But of course, that could also be extended to women who were their teachers, who they could be seen as a fundamental and important person in that young person's life. And Stephen and I, my colleague Stephen and I, have just written a paper on advancing the concept of school-related gender-based violence as an encompassing and consistent concept to use when we're talking about these problems and issues. This is the research that we have published on this topic so far. These are all open access papers, but I'll put my email is here. If you'd like copies of anything, please get in touch. We have a forthcoming special issue in Gender and Education that will feature research from 12 different countries on manosphere ideology in schools. And we have a forthcoming book that will be published next year on schooling misogyny. And that's all. Did I go over? I don't know.